Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar on assessment development committees and the roles of those committees. I am Michelle McAdams, and I head up our assessment development team here at the department. I do want to apologize. My voice is a little squeaky. I'm getting over a cold. So if at any point something I say is difficult to hear or understand, don't hesitate to just send a question and say, hey, can you repeat that? I have no problem doing that. But thanks again for joining us. Assessment development is a pretty rigorous process for us, and the committees that we bring in at multiple points are critical to that development process for a variety of reasons. And so this presentation is, we'll go through that, the different parts of the process and the different committees along the way. And then we'll get into, one, how participants benefit from being a part of committees, but then also how the state and our tests and our students benefit from educators participating on these committees. We really cannot do it without our committees. So it's pretty important for teachers and supervisors to understand the process. Because when y'all understand the process for assessment development, you really kind of see all the different ways that we build in these safeguards and quality controls to make sure that the assessments that we're developing, the items that we're developing, are of the highest quality. And then through participating in these educator review committees, teachers and supervisors, one, you help double check us, making sure that everything is aligned to standards, that we can say all of our assessments are standards aligned and it gets down all the way to the item level, that they are appropriate for the grade or course, and that they're appropriate for Louisiana students, because not all items are. It just kind of depends. Also, educators that do this kind of work really learn how to better use assessments in their classrooms. Lots of times, really almost all committee members I've worked with have, on leaving, said things like, this is the best PD I've ever had. I've learned so much from this process. It's very rare that we get somebody who says, yeah, don't call me again. So it's a really, really worthwhile process, critical for development for state tests, but a worthwhile process certainly for anyone who participates in it as well. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I don't know why I keep scrolling. Okay, so the process, in a nutshell, the complete process, it starts with item development or acquisition, and I'll talk about the difference between those two things. And within that first stage are 3 different types of reviews. Not every content area has all of these reviews, and again, I'll talk about the difference. But there's passage, source, and stimulus reviews, which we started adding in this year as sort of a pre-measure before we even get into development. And we're finding that it's been a fairly worthwhile endeavor for us to add in this sort of pre-step before we even get into the actual item development process. Then we have item content and bias reviews and item alignment reviews. The next stage in the process is then field testing, where we'll have what are called range finding committees, and these are my favorite, I'm not gonna lie. And then we also have the data review committees. Now, data review can kind of sound a little overwhelming. You do not need to be a strong math-minded person to really be able to be of value in a committee like this. And I'll talk about the type of things that data review committees look at. And then once an item goes through the development process, the field testing process, all these committees, then if it makes it through all of that, it ends up in our operational test bank. So let's start by looking at the passage, source, and stimulus reviews. This is specific to ELA, social studies, and science. Math doesn't have any of this, doesn't have this stage. And really, this is about Before we get into the item development, we want to make sure that the passages for ELA that we're selecting are appropriate, that they're on grade level, that they are engaging, that they are representative of our students. And so before we actually develop items, because what we don't want is to develop an entire passage set and then bring it to item review and a committee say, oh, well, it's not good from the start because the passage isn't appropriate. And so we've spent time and money and energy developing all these items for a set that we couldn't use from the very beginning because the passage wasn't appropriate, or the source or sources weren't appropriate, or a stimulus wasn't appropriate. So this is a step we've added in a pre-review, sort of. And so the vendor that we're contracted with, and it's different vendors depending on the content area. For math and ELA, we contract with Data Recognition Corps, and for Science and Social Studies, our development is through WestEd. And so these vendors will select the passages, sources, stimuli, and they send it to our assessment development coordinators, who then review the passages, and we involve instructional people within LDOE and different supervisors and even other assessment coordinators for other content areas, and sort of do a pre-selection based on that. And then we review and provide feedback, and maybe the vendor will provide a different option or whatever. But once we feel like we're in a pretty good place with those passages, sources, whatever, then we bring it to committee, who then gives us a final say. They'll say, yes, this passage is great. It works great for third graders. It's really engaging. My third graders would love it. It's got appropriate language, and it's easily accessible. Or they might say, this source, it's good. It really fits within this content area for social studies, but maybe if we add in some edits to define some of these words, that would make it a better fit for this grade and more accessible. Or maybe they're just looking at a stimuli, and it really feels like, even though we want to develop something for 6th grade on it, maybe it's more appropriate for 7th grade. And so maybe that committee will then reject it, or it'll get moved to 7th grade, and a 7th grade committee will then review it. So this is really the first stage in the development process for those particular content areas. Once we get through that, then our vendor develops items. They either write items for all content areas, or for math or ELA, our vendor acquires item banks. And so that's, that's a little different for review. But let's talk about actual writing items first. So our vendor writes items, and then our assessment development coordinators review and collect feedback from our instructional and curriculum side, and then we provide feedback to the vendors, and there's several rounds of review. And once those items are in a really good shape, then we bring them in front of committees who review for a variety of areas. Again, for grade level appropriateness, for alignment to Louisiana student standards, or bias and sensitivity concerns. We want to make sure that there's nothing in an item that's going to disadvantage any particular group of students, or that might be something that's sensitive to students, that might cause them to not perform well in the item that has nothing to do with their actual skill. And so committees will then review the items for that. And much like the passage reviews and stimuli and source reviews, they will either accept and say, oh, this looks great, this is wonderful. Or they'll say, you know what, this is pretty good, but here are some edits to make it better. Or I really can't take this as it is, but if we do these edits, then I can. Or they'll say, you know what, this is just really off the mark, and we can't use this. and so the committee will reject it. And so from there, the assessment coordinators will then apply the feedback and edits that they get from the committee. Items that are rejected might go back into like a revised pool where they might get brought to a different committee later on after it's been revised. Sometimes items are just beyond saving and they get rejected and we never see them again, and that's fine too. The other type of item content and bias reviews deals with items that are acquired from an established bank. Now, any items that are acquired from an established bank, and this applies to ELA and math, those items have already gone through the entire process that I'm going to discuss in this whole webinar. But they've already undergone that entire process through field testing, made it into an operational bank. What we're reviewing for is to make sure that they are aligned to Louisiana student standards, because our standards are slightly different from most of the national standards. Most of the standards used in other states. Excuse me. Making sure that they're appropriate for Louisiana students, so it doesn't involve a context that, you know, only kids in North Dakota would really understand or something like that. And then, again, considering any bias or sensitivity concerns, making sure they're accessible. The difference with how the committee responds to these types of items is, since they come from an established bank, we can't edit them. We can't make changes to them. We can either accept them or reject them. And so if a committee accepts, that's great. And if they reject, we just can't ever use that item. And it goes back to that vendor, that bank that we've got it from, and I don't know what they do with it, but we don't use it. So once it goes through all of these item reviews, then it ends up on a field test. And the best method is embedded field testing, which is what we do for just general regular upkeep of our tests. But occasionally, like with science this year when we're building a new test, we have to do an all-field test year, and that's fine. And that's not ideal, but it's what you got to do when you have to kind of start over. So, but the rest of the content areas use embedded field testing, and science will use embedded field testing next year in the new operational forms. And that means that we just stick items in there that don't count towards the student score, that we are just gathering some data on. And it's just a handful of items, excuse me, per content area for grades, for each grade. And so with the field testing, once that's done, we have two different types of reviews. The first is a range finding, which is kind of a funny name, but it's probably one of my favorite committees. This one's a little bit smaller committee, and what happens is that once the item is field tested, we're talking about constructive response and extended response items, then our vendor collects and pre-scores student responses based on the rubric that we developed for that item. And I say pre-scores because what then happens is they send it to LDOE for review, and our assessment development coordinators will then look at their pre-scores and provide some feedback on it. And maybe we need to make recommendations about adjusting the rubric, and often that's the case. And then once that's done, we bring it to committees. The committees then will score hundreds of responses, the ones that were pre-scored by the vendor. And they will provide guidelines for the actual scoring of the item. They are the ones that say, you know, for this math CR item that's worth 4 points, this is what will get you a 4. This is what will get a student a 3. This is what gets a 2. Here's the difference between a 2 and a 1. And from the hundreds of responses for each item that they score, our vendor develops training sets. And I'm actually presenting this webinar right now from Minnesota at one of our scoring centers where they are training social studies hand scorers for our social studies ER and CR items using the training materials developed out of Louisiana range finding committee reviews. And so it's great that when the hand scorers have a question, well, I'm not sure, I understand why this is happening. We have notes from our Louisiana educators that say, oh, well, our committee said that this is the reason. And so our hand scorers who, are Minnesotans who don't necessarily know, the ins and outs of Louisiana students and our thought processes, but they learn how to score the way Louisiana educators say that these social studies items need to be scored. And that's true for all of our content areas. And so the range finding committee is a really, really rewarding experience for the classroom teacher, especially one that really could do to see what a thorough collaborative scoring process looks like. We will have sessions at the Teacher Leader Summit devoted to social studies scoring. We're internally, we call it our mini range finding summit session, but they'll be about collaborative scoring in social studies and how that benefits both teachers and students. So I can highly recommend that one. Then, once we get past range finding, all of our items that we field tested will go through a data review. And this can be intimidating for lots of teachers. It sounds a little scary, but it's really not. Our vendor goes through a very rigorous process of analyzing each item and the set and the statistical performance related to it. So by statistical performance, I mean, the percent of students who get the item correct, or the percent of students who are scoring a 4 on the CR, percent of students scoring a 3, looking at certain flags, like if an item has a very low performance, so it's got a low percentage of students getting it correct, then we'll look at, well, what answer is drawing them in? Is there one and only one correct answer? Is that just a really good wrong answer? And the best example I have is for math. A lot of the wrong answers are steps in the process. So you have like a 3-step problem. The student has to do 3 steps to get to the answer. More likely than not, at least a couple of the wrong answers are going to be steps in that process where they just didn't go far enough. And then sometimes we find out that, maybe something is just wrong with this item. And what will happen is that we bring these items to committee and we say, okay, this item has been flagged for a low percentage correct. Take a look at the correct answer, but then also take a look at this particular wrong answer and see, is there something in the item that is misleading and causing the student to pick the wrong one? Or could, we could say that it potentially is causing the student to pick the wrong one, or maybe it's just a really good wrong answer. Maybe it is just, it's the most common mistake, and this is a hard concept. Things like that. And so it's not that the teachers need to actually dig into the statistical numbers so much, but it's more about, we say, hey, this item is doing this. Can you take a look at it and tell us, if you think that there's something wrong with it? And then from there, the committee will decide to either accept or reject. And sometimes they can offer suggestions for revision, and that's great too. And we'll take it back, and we then bring it back to review committees, and it'll get re-field tested. But if it does not get completely accepted at data review, this is every item. If it doesn't get accepted at data review, it does not make it into the operational bank. So that is the complete process from the beginning of development, the pre-development, through field testing into our operational bank. So we need committee members. All of our content areas have committees running starting at the end of May through September. And we need a lot of people. So here's a general kind of slide that talks about kind of what we're looking for in committee members. Notice that there's nowhere on here that says that they need to be, state teacher of the year. Not that we would not accept a state teacher of the year, but our committee members, what we're looking for is that we have a good representation. So we have a good representation of the state. We've got educators from North Louisiana and Cenla and the Southwest and, Baton Rouge area and Acadiana and the New Orleans area, and we have some charter representation. So we want to make sure that we are reaching all the regions of the state. And I'll say we have a particularly difficult time getting educators from Cenla and North Louisiana. And I know part of that is, concerns about travel, but our vendor does provide lodging for participants. The slide says farther than 60 miles. That's one of our vendors. The other vendor, it's actually farther than 50 miles. So it just kind of depends on which committee it is. So I put 60 just to make it square in both cases. But so that the vendor provides the lodging. For anyone that has to travel that long distance, breakfast and lunch is provided for all participants. For employees on the summer break, or if it's a holiday or school's not in session for whatever reason, there's a stipend, a daily stipend pay. One of the vendors, it's $120 a day. I think they're both, but I haven't gotten confirmation from the second one. The other vendor, it would be right around $120 per day. And then vendors also reimburse. So mileage for all participants, no matter where they're coming from. Dinner for participants who are staying in a hotel. So for the participants that are driving back and forth each day, they wouldn't get reimbursed for dinner. And then if school is in session, the vendor reimburses substitute teachers, provided that the teacher who attended submits the form to their district. So we do compensate for teachers that need to travel. We also, besides being regionally diverse, we need teachers who are demographically diverse so that we have both men and women on committees. Women are not hard to find, but men in particular are a little difficult, and that's just because we are a female-dominated field. And even more so in ELA and the elementary grades. But we also need to make sure that the committees are racially diverse and ethnically diverse to really represent the demographics of our state. We need to make sure that the committee represents special needs populations and different levels of learning. Oftentimes, when we reach out to supervisors for recommendations for participants, they want to recommend, the nice, shiny teacher who's been teaching for 20 years, who teaches all honors kids, and that's great. That's a perspective that we need. But our committee needs to be well-rounded, and it can't all be teachers like that. We need teachers who are teaching, economically disadvantaged, primarily economically disadvantaged students. We need teachers who teach, special education, both gifted students and students with, low cognitive functioning and, learning disabilities. We need teachers who, work with visually impaired students. We need these perspectives. We need teachers who teach English language learners. We regularly struggle to find these particular teachers. So we need all of our committees need this diversity and representation. And then just in general, we're looking for knowledgeable, dedicated, responsible people. We want to make sure that, when they're in the meeting, they're focused on what we're doing. They're not distracted. They're not trying to do other work at the same time. That's rare, but it happens. We don't have somebody who's stepping out every hour to make a phone call or something like that. And then, it's secure information, so participants have to sign a non-disclosure, one more time, a non-disclosure agreement. So we want to make sure that they are, they're responsible enough to follow that agreement that is binding. So that's just kind of that general makeup in a nutshell. In particular, this is kind of the committee makeup. For the passage choice stimulus reviews, we're looking for 6 to 8 participants, mostly classroom teachers, definitely some specialized teachers. And by specialized, that's what I mean, like special education, English language learner, those teachers. And then, 1 or 2 supervisors. And same for item content and bias review, item alignment review, although we can sometimes go up to 10 participants. It depends on if the committee is, specific to just one grade or if it's a grade band committee. By grade band, I mean, it's a committee that covers grades 3 through 5. Then that one might be a little bit bigger. Range finding is a bit smaller because it's a more focused work, and it is generally more about the committee members that we really need are classroom teachers that are scoring student responses regularly in their classroom. They really understand how kids respond, what kids mean, and so those range finding committees, the classroom teachers are critical for those. And then data review. For data review, we really want to have almost all or all of the same participants from item content and bias review committee, but that doesn't always work out. So there is the case where, we would have new people on those committees, but again, we would try to, for those, we would try to select people who've worked with us before. That's not to say we wouldn't have somebody completely new on one of those committees. So definitely, if that's something that you're interested in, you would do well to sign up for that one too. There's one more committee. It is not a part of the item development process or the assessment development process, but it is a part of, it is a critical part of our assessment reporting and validity, and that is a standard setting committee. This is a special committee that only happens at certain times, and so this summer we have the U.S. History Standard Setting Committee. Last summer we had the Social Studies 3 through 8 Standard Setting Committees. And this committee convenes after the first year of an operational assessment. So for U.S. History, this was the first year that we did the LEAP 2025 5-level U.S. History test. So they'll meet this summer, and they're going to determine the cut scores for each achievement level. And then they're going to make recommendations for the achievement level descriptors that will eventually be sent to BESI for approval. Next summer, it's going to be all science standard setting. So we've got a lot coming up. So how does somebody get involved in one of these committees? Well, what we would like for you to do is complete an interest survey. And so teachers and supervisors who are interested would complete the survey. You can complete as many as you'd like across content areas. We have some elementary who feel comfortable doing both ELA and social studies, so they have completed interest surveys for both of those courses, and that's great. That certainly helps us in flexibility in designing the committee makeup. But this is just an information gathering tool for us so that we can make sure that when we are building our committees that we are hitting all of our needs, that we're building a committee that's regionally diverse, that's demographically diverse, that represents all the needs and populations of our students. So anyone and everyone who completes a survey is considered, but selection is not guaranteed. There's just a finite number of spots. Within each interest survey is more specific information about meeting dates and what to expect or when to expect to hear responses and that sort of thing. You can access these interest surveys in the assessment guidance library. We have a document which I've also added to the download files box, along with they're both PDFs. They're both titled exactly the same, but one is the presentation and one is the document with the interest survey links. So either way, I didn't think about that when I was naming them. But this document, Assessment Development Educator Review Committees, again, has the descriptions of all the committees. It has a description of reimbursements for teachers and travel expenses and things like that. It talks about the approval process for superintendents, but then it also lists out every interest survey that we have open right now. It also includes the closing dates for those surveys. And we will update it periodically as surveys close and new committees are scheduled. And you can see in the slide, it is right at the top of our assessment guidance page now. So speaking of interest surveys closing soon, Friday, April 13th, this Friday, we have a lot of surveys closing. And we still have a very high need, particularly for special education, English language learner teachers, teachers of the visually impaired. We're very fortunate that Louisiana School for the Visually Impaired is always willing to send teachers. They just can't cover every committee that we have. And we certainly, want representation of teachers who teach the visually impaired from across the state. So, yeah, we really do need that. So for this Friday, we have several item content and bias reviews, committees closing, the survey is closing for science and social studies. Item alignment reviews for math and ELA are closing. And then for range finding, our high school biology, U.S. history, algebra and geometry, and LEAP Connect ELA are closing. Now for LEAP Connect ELA, that is grades 3 through 8, and those, the teachers and supervisors needed for this committee are for students with significant disabilities. And they need full committees as well. And then some other closing dates to be aware of. Just a week later, April 20th, we'll have the math content and bias reviews closing, range finding for social studies 6 to 8, math 3 to 8, and science 3 to 8. Those will close. And then May 4th, the data review for math, ELA, and biology, U.S. history standard setting. And then June 29th, data review for science 3 to 8. There will be a, I lost my train of thought, sorry. If you have any other questions, feel free to email any of our assessment development coordinators, or if you just need some more information. I've listed them out by content area, or you can always just email me directly. I'm listed at the bottom. In the PDF with the interest survey links, this contact information is also listed there. And so what we really need is for you guys to get out there, fill out an interest survey, recommend, try to recruit 2 people each to fill out these surveys and just spread the word. Ask them to find people just so we can get as many people and we can get the coverage that we need. So that takes us about 5 minutes over. Does anybody have any questions? If you have a question, you can type it into the question and answer box. Okay, and if you come up with a question later, like I said, don't hesitate to reach out. You can, if you don't remember any of these, you can email assessment@la.gov and it'll get routed to me. So thank you so much for giving your time up this morning to attend. And please, please, please get the word out. Thank you. Have a good day.
This has been a presentation of the Louisiana Department of Education, copyright 2018, all rights reserved. For more information or to contact the Louisiana Department of Education, on the web go to www.louisianabelieves.com or call 1-877-453-2721.